This is a lecture on arguments and evidence. An argument is a presentation of evidence. It's a set of declarative sentences. One of those sentences is the conclusion, and the rest are premises. The premises are offered as evidence for the conclusion. That's easy, right? I'll bet I don't need to work too hard to convince you that evaluating evidence is a very important part of almost any activity. If you're deciding what to believe and that decision is at all important, is it better to decide in light of evidence or without evidence? If you're deciding what to do and the decision is at all important, is it better to decide in light of evidence or without evidence? If you're trying to decide whether to invest in Tesla or take an internship with DTE or start watching Cobra Kai or believe some rumor or download the Boyfriend app or make any of the hundreds of decisions you make weekly, it'd be better if you could quickly and correctly evaluate the evidence you've got. In fact, for any voluntary thing you can do with your mind, isn't it better to perform it in light of evidence? Of course. So we agree that evidence is important. That's why we're evaluating arguments. Since we agree on the importance of evidence, you'll definitely be able to answer this question. What is evidence? In other words, when is A evidence for B? Maybe you think, well, A is evidence for B when A supports B. Sure, but when does A support B? If I'm trying to understand what evidence is, this definition doesn't really help. If you're trying to understand what makes a quality movie, you might ask, when does a movie become an Oscar nominee? If I answer, when the Oscar committee selects it, would that get to what you're asking? My answer is correct, but it's not very helpful for understanding the question you were really asking. When is A evidence for B? When A proves B? Look out a window at some houses or buildings nearby. If you have access to a window, look out of one. Do you have evidence that there are people in at least one of those buildings you can see? What is that evidence? Maybe there are lights on. You see some cars by the building or in the driveway. Maybe you hear some sounds from out there. You see steam from chimneys. Maybe it's just a good time for there to be people in the buildings. You know there are retirees in your neighborhood and they're bound to be home. Or maybe you're looking out at some buildings and their workplaces, and it's appropriate for people to be in the workplace at this time. These things are evidence. Are they proof that there are people in the neighborhood? Have you proved it? Isn't it possible that the area was evacuated unbeknownst to you because of a gas leak and people left the lights on, they abandoned their cars, and they left their furnaces running, and so on? Isn't it possible that you are in the middle of a zone that's been evacuated and there's nobody around? It's not likely. Hopefully you're still safe. But isn't it possible? You haven't proved that there are people around, but you do have evidence. So A proves B is too strong as a definition for evidence. Some evidence falls short of proof. Well, back to our question then, when is A evidence for B? When most people conclude B upon hearing A? That definition has the benefit of being testable, at least. If you want to know when A is evidence for B, you can just do an experiment and you tell people A. And if they think, B, then A is evidence for B. Any problems with that definition come to mind? Here's a brief aside. Let me tell you a story about Mary. She's 31 years old. She's bright and energetic. In college, she majored in women's studies, and she's interested in issues of social justice. She every now and then participates in demonstrations. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to rank these potential descriptions of Mary from most to least likely. I'm not saying that any of them are especially likely. I just want you to rank them relative to each other. Which of them is most likely? Is Mary a banker? Is it more likely that Mary's a baker? Or is it more likely that Mary's a banker that's an active feminist? Pause the video and rank A, B, and C in order from most likely to least likely. Write your answer down. You probably have something like this: C first, then A, then B, or maybe B first, and then C, and then A. Probably you have C above A, unless you made a fortunate error. Most people do. Now think about this. Suppose a person you meet online says he lives in the same state as you and lives in the same city as you. Now that I read that, that sounds kind of creepy, but ignore the creepiness of it for now. Which of these is more likely? That this person lives in the same state as you, or that he lives in the same city and the same state as you? Well, obviously that he lives in the same state as you. There are ways to live in the same state without living in the same city. There aren't ways to live in the same city without living in the same state. Never mind examples like Kansas City. The second option here requires the first and more. So the second option can't be more likely than the first. Do you want to change your answer now to this question? Look, the third option, C, includes the first one and more. C has Mary being a banker that's also a feminist. A is just that Mary's a banker. It can't be that C is more likely than A. Kahneman and Tversky showed in a famous paper in 1983, that most people do conclude that feminist banker is more likely than banker when they hear those facts about Mary. Their point was to discover why people screw up. That's interesting, but I only want to use this example to show that people do in fact screw up. It's a statistical impossibility that feminist banker be more likely for Mary than just banker. Now, those trivial facts about Mary are not evidence that your statistics textbook is wrong. You shouldn't stop your instructor in statistics class and say, "I have evidence that all of this is a lie. Let me tell you about Mary." It just isn't evidence, those facts about Mary, for the statistical impossibility, even though most people conclude the statistical impossibility from the facts about Mary. That shows this definition won't work. This definition is too broad. It includes cases it shouldn't. So back to our question. When is A evidence for B? This time, let's just try a minor modification of the last definition. What about this? A is evidence for B when people should conclude B upon learning A. Not that they actually do, but that they ought to. This solves the last problem, which was that people in fact screw up. They shouldn't have, right? My guess is that you don't like this definition. I don't like it either, but I'm pretty sure our reasons for disliking it are different. You don't like the word should in there. You think, who's to say what people should conclude? Who's the ultimate boss? Isn't that just an opinion? You'll be able to say what people should conclude. There's clearly a right way and a wrong way to draw conclusions. It's why we evaluate evidence. For example, don't you think you screwed up the last question about Mary? You're convinced that you did now. You shouldn't have screwed it up, right? And if somebody asks you a similar question in the future, you'll be on your guard and you won't screw it up. Well, back to our definition. I think this definition is pretty close, but it does allow too much to count as evidence again. It's too broad. Suppose you're in a trial for a promising experimental technique that's designed to treat a fatal condition. That is, you're desperately ill, and the only thing available to you is an experimental trial. Now, you're in the trial, and someone reminds you about the placebo effect. Someone reminds you that sometimes people who are taking inert substances are sometimes cured just because they believe they're taking a promising cure. Should you believe that you're receiving the real treatment, even though you know that trials all include a control group where some people don't get any real treatment at all? They just get a placebo? Yep, absolutely. You should try to believe that you're receiving the real treatment. Use whatever you can to try and believe it. It could save your life. Of course, the placebo effect is not evidence that you're receiving the real treatment, but it is a reason that you should try to believe it. That shows our last definition isn't quite right either. So what is evidence? You ready? Here's the correct answer finally. A is evidence for B when A is true, and A would either guarantee B is true or make B likely. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that definition, and over the term, we'll unpack it. We'll come to fully understand this definition of evidence. We're going to talk a lot in terms of arguments. I'll use terminology like argument. A is an argument for B. But our focus is evidence and how best to evaluate it.